This is the longest lens that Sony makes. It's a 400 to 800mm zoom, and this week I'm taking it to Namibia to put it through its paces and see what it can do. First impressions are, it's a beautifully proportioned and balanced lens. What you'll immediately notice is that this is an internally zooming lens. Many long telephoto lenses like this in the past have been telescoping, which means as you zoom, the lens gets longer, which I don't tend to like from a handling perspective. It shifts the balance, the lens rings are often much stiffer, and it takes much more force to move that lens through its zoom range. I can already tell you this lens is remarkably light given it's an 800mm. The weight is easily hand-holdable, so the headline feature is obviously that maximum focal length of 800mm. And in terms of the aperture you're getting, it's an f6.3 to f8. Without further ado, let's pack up and get out there. For the past few days I've been testing out the 400 to 800 here at Ongava Reserve and Okonjima Reserve in Namibia. And the main things I've been assessing have been the autofocus and the handling of the lens. And straight away I can say that the autofocus is incredibly impressive. It's extremely quick and snappy, locks onto a subject really quickly, and the tracking is as good as any Sony lens I've tried. It shifts from close to far almost instantly and locks on straight away to whatever you're pointing it at. But the other question I had was how well the autofocus would perform as the light started to fade. And when it does get dark, it obviously does start to struggle eventually. But I found actually the autofocus worked perfectly fine, all the way down to the sort of light levels where I hit the ISO, where I couldn't really get usable photos anymore. I've also found that hand holding this lens is no problem at all. It's really not very heavy, and it's actually a very nimble, compact lens given the reach that it provides. Even when I've been shooting from the cramped confines of the driver's seat of my car, I've found that this lens is really easy to handle. The zoom ring is also perfectly positioned to be able to easily manipulate the zoom without having to shift my hand position from the center of gravity of the lens. So let's talk about that aperture of f6.3 to f8. I find that because of the long focal length, that's still plenty to be able to isolate the subject and get those beautiful creamy backgrounds and blurred elements in the foreground. So subject isolation really hasn't been a problem with this, simply because of the focal length. So the only real time that it's a compromise is in low light conditions, really at the beginning and end of the day. And it simply means you really have to bump your ISO up, which, as I've said before, with today's modern cameras and their high ISO performance, combined with denoising software on the computer, we can shoot at much higher ISOs than we ever used to be able to. And so even that hasn't really been causing me any concern. And so that maximum aperture of f8, I don't think is a big deal breaker. And what this lens offers in terms of reach and versatility with the zoom really more than makes up for that. If you wanted a faster lens, you're either going to be limited to going something like the 70-200 f2.8 or the 100-400, which both give you more light to play with, but nowhere near the reach. And then if you go to one of the primes, like the 400 2.8 or the 600 f4, fine, you do get much better performance in low light, but that comes at a huge cost in terms of the size and weight of the lens. The cost of the lens, that's 4 or 5 times the price of this lens, and you lose the versatility of the zoom. So it's actually a pretty tough decision to make if you had a fast prime like the 600 or 400, whether actually shooting with that a lot of the time provides much benefit when you can get so much more versatility and reach with a lens like this. So in good light, I would be tempted to reach for this a lot of the time. And then it just comes down to how much shooting you're going to be doing in relatively dim conditions as to whether having a faster lens will suit you better. But of course this can be combined, and maybe a dream combination would be to have this lens plus then a faster lens for when the light starts to fade, such as the 300 f2.8, a 70-200 f2.8, or maybe the 100-400. But yeah, this lens certainly now makes decision making a bit trickier. Now the other thing I've been testing out is whether this works with a 2x teleconverter. And to be honest, I didn't have high expectations, because putting a 2x converter on this turns it into an f13-16 lens, which would be apertures that I would never really consider shooting at. But of course the reach then turns this into an 800-1600 lens, which is crazy. So I decided to put it on for a bit and do some shooting from a hide, and I found that it's actually totally usable. By resting the camera, I could eliminate camera shake. I wasn't using a tripod, just hand holding and resting the front to stabilize it. And I found it very easy to get sharp photos that way. I didn't have high hopes for the autofocus at those apertures, but honestly, it worked just as usual in good light. The caveat there is that it was good light, and I think even on a very overcast day, maybe it would struggle a bit more. But even at 1600mm f16, I was finding the autofocus was working really well, and even the animal eye autofocus was working. So really, this lens is a fantastic option for wildlife photography, and I'd say for photographing birds, this is probably the best lens I've ever used, because it's hand holdable, it's very maneuverable, and so tracking birds in flight is perfectly doable. You've also got that zoom, and so sometimes at 800mm it can be hard to find the subject, but with the zoom you can start zoomed out at 400mm, get the subject in your frame and quickly shift the zoom in as you start to photograph it. And I find that works really well, particularly with birds in flight where they're all over the sky. It's really hard to get them in the frame, and then once you do and lock on, it's then easy to follow them. And then you've got that great Sony tracking autofocus as well to help you out. Right now it's February, and that is peak wet season here in Namibia, and I love photographing in the wet season. The bush is vibrant and lush, the animals are all healthy, and the air is clear. But what I didn't expect was that the landscape would be covered in these gorgeous yellow flowers. And for me, that's meant I've become a bit obsessed with trying to photograph animals in these yellow flowers and show that beautiful context around my subjects. Now, when trying to capture context like that, that's where a zoom really does come in handy. Often I'll find I might need to zoom out a bit just to get more context around my subject. And on safari, you're often limited to shooting within a vehicle, which limits your ability to get further or closer to a subject, particularly if, like in a lot of places, you have to stay on the road. A zoom lens is the only way you can choose just how much context you put in around your subject. So in conclusion, incredible autofocus performance, amazing versatility and handling, very compact and incredibly light. And the only limitations really come when shooting in low light, or if you wanted to travel very light with a 2-lens setup. It'd be hard to achieve that with this lens and have a wide range of focal lengths covered, whereas a lens like the 100-400 or even the 200-600 would allow you to perhaps just travel with one other lens. For me, this lens paired with a medium zoom like the 70-200 and then a wide angle like the 24-70 would be a really good versatile 3-lens combination. I think if you wanted just 2 lenses, then something like the 200-600 with the 24-105 could be a good option. Image quality wise, I haven't done any scientific testing, but everything I've put on the computer has looked lovely and sharp and crisp, and so I can't see that there's anything to complain about there. I hope you found this initial field test video useful. I've also put together a video comparing the 400-800 with the 200-600 and the 100-400, which you can watch here. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, please subscribe for more content like this. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Bye for now.